Hey, what makes a Pokemon game a Pokemon game? If you've played any games before, you'd probably say it's a game where you start by picking one of 3 starter Pokemon and having a rival battle. Then fight through some gyms and a bad guy team so you can have a boss battle against the legendary on the cover of the box before going on to fight the Elite Four, or something equivalent, and the region's champion. You know, the same stuff that's been in every Pokemon game since the late 90s. Except, I don't think that's really what makes a Pokemon game. Sure, the original games had those elements to them. That's not what made those games special. Unlike most other games of the time, Pokemon games weren't about the world of the game or the people in it. They were about you, the player, having an adventure, and every single aspect of these games was designed around that idea. Think about how the original games start. The first thing you do in Red and Blue is pick your starter Pokemon, which is a huge decision with a lot of ramifications. Who you start with changes which Pokemon you choose later to help round out your team, and which trainers and gym leaders will be the most challenging. In other words, it shapes your subjective experience of what the game will be. And the rest of the game was built to encourage the player having their own journey, exploring and growing and overcoming challenges essentially as themselves in this world. That's really what the original Pokemon formula was all about, and it's what made the game stand out so much. In an industry filled with games focused on fictional characters going on whatever nonsense quests they felt the need to complete, Pokemon games focused on you and your story of discovering a brand new world. All of those features I listed in the beginning were only in the games because they helped facilitate that experience. They weren't that important in and of themselves. But the newer games in the franchise clearly don't understand this. They have all of the superficial elements that were present in the original games, but implemented them in a way that completely undermines their original intent. Pokemon games from the last 10 years aren't really Pokemon games in anything but name. An important part of what made the early Pokemon games so much fun was that it actually felt like you were going on an adventure. You were thrown into a brand new world with no knowledge about what to expect, and nothing to help you except for your trusty starter. It was mysterious and exciting, because you never knew what was coming around the corner, but it was always worth finding out. And that was no accident. The developers clearly wanted players to feel that way because they filled the world with stuff to explore. Every route has branching paths and hidden treasures to find all over the place. Vast dungeons are littered throughout the world for you to explore and conquer, and there are literally 150 unique Pokemon for the player to track down and catch. Everything in these games was put in intentionally to create a feeling of exploration and adventure. And nothing captured the spirit of these games quite like the legendaries. Legendaries are these living myths that you can fight and catch, and throughout the game, different characters tell you legends about these Pokemon, building them up as challenging and worthwhile Pokemon for the player to catch. But even finding them is a challenge in and of itself. Each legendary is located in remote dungeons hidden throughout the map that are filled with lots of strong Pokemon you need to get through before you can even challenge the legendaries themselves. And catching them was incredibly rewarding, because it wasn't just that you beat a really strong boss to prove your strength, you now got to use them and all of their power for the entire rest of the game. But the cherry on top of this amazing sundae was that these legendaries weren't mandatory boss battles that were part of the main story. They were completely optional to find, so optional that you could probably finish the game without even knowing they exist. But that also means if you do go out of your way to thoroughly explore the world and do end up finding and catching them, it's a much more satisfying experience. Only players who were the most committed and fully embraced the spirit of these games would catch them. And because of how strong these Pokemon were, they felt like tangible rewards for being so driven and ambitious, not just in the context of the game, but even in real life. It was your achievement, not your character's, and it made for a really amazing gameplay experience. Now, in saying all this, I don't mean to suggest that the original games were perfect in achieving these goals, because they weren't. Exploration and discovery can only be so exciting when everything looks like garbage, but that issue is almost exclusively due to the technical limitations of the Game Boy. In theory, with better console technology, a game with the same design philosophy could do all of this stuff 1,000 times better. You could have more varied places to explore, more branching paths, more items to find, more powerful Pokemon to catch, and everything could look like not garbage. And for a while, Pokemon sort of did that. For the next 10 years, each game came out with a bigger world to explore, more Pokemon to catch, and incrementally better graphics. And while the games were too scared to innovate from the established formula of the first ones, they did pretty much maximize its potential. But eventually, Pokemon had a decision to make. There were only so many minor improvements you could make while staying within the constraints of the established formula for almost 15 years. In a better company, the directors might have used this as an opportunity to change the formula and create a new style of Pokemon game that would be more true to the spirit of adventure and discovery that made the original game special, kind of like what Breath of the Wild did for the Zelda franchise. Instead, the games used the exact same formula again, but added a much bigger emphasis on the main story. And it didn't really work. I mean, it didn't ruin the game or anything, but nothing in the game was changed except for the fact that you had more recurring characters with more dialogue than in previous games. And the writing wasn't particularly good in general, but certainly not good enough to justify focusing on the story instead of exploration. Again, it didn't ruin the games or anything, but it really didn't make them any better, and the response to this generation of games was extremely lukewarm as a result. Despite this, future games ended up continuing along this trend, focusing more and more on the story and less on the world itself. I think this was in large part due to the jump to 3D, which in my opinion pretty much ruined the franchise. Now, I recognize that that's a strong statement to make, but if you play any of the 3D games, it's immediately obvious that a lot of things went horribly wrong in the development. It seems like despite how much more complex and time-consuming it is to make a 3D game, the Pokemon Company still treated the newer games like 2D ones, even having the same deadlines and developers as the old games did, so they ended up having to cut corners everywhere and water down basically the entire game. From a technical perspective, the 3D games all look and feel substantially worse than the 2D ones. All of the new character models are bland and lifeless and somehow even less expressive than the old 2D sprites. The games also constantly dropped in frame rate during routine battles because they weren't optimized properly for the hardware. This is somehow true for every 3D Pokemon game that has come out since 2013, and the company somehow seems to have gotten worse at making 3D games since the first one. But to me, that's still nothing compared to the unmitigated disaster that is the new gameplay experience. Anything resembling side content has been completely ripped out of the 3D games. There are no more branching paths, basically no dungeons to explore, and the game even took out all legendaries aside from the main one who joins your team at a predetermined point in the story. Instead of being a magical and inviting world for the player to express their intrinsic sense of adventure, the new games basically take you through a guided tour of a Pokemon-themed amusement park. And considering that Pokemon's actual gameplay was never that strong in the first place, the games are now all a complete slog to play through. Somehow, despite having literally hundreds or even thousands of times as much computing power at their disposal, these new games created bland and lifeless experiences that pale in comparison to the originals. And look, most of these problems are clearly because of a lack of developer time and resources, but it also seems like the higher-ups wanted to focus primarily on the story instead of the world. There's a much bigger emphasis on the characters and their stories in the 3D games than in almost any of the 2D ones, to the point where they dominate these games. But there's a reason why the 2D games, which had a lot of the same creative team as the 3D ones, didn't focus too much on their characters. The main story of every Pokemon game has basically been about the player's relationship with the rivals. While there are other subplots in these games, the main through line is about how the rivals interact with the player, and as a result, the narrative experience depends heavily on how the rivals are designed. So let's start by taking a look at Blue, your rival in the original Pokemon games. Just like everything else in those original games, Blue was designed to create a more personal experience for the player. He was intended to be a direct comparison for the player to see exactly how they should be progressing. This is established in the first few minutes of the game, when you pick your starter Pokemon. As soon as you've picked your Pokemon, Blue comes in and deliberately chooses a Pokemon that your starter is weak to, and then immediately insults you and challenges you to a battle. From this first meeting, Blue antagonizes you and sets the precedent that your battles with him are personal. Beating him isn't just about progressing in the game, it's about proving you're better than him and teaching him a lesson. And from that moment on, Blue looms over you everywhere you go. You see his name at gyms you just arrived at, proving he beat them even before you did. He shows up in exclusive places that really only you should be able to get into, and he's constantly ambushing you in the middle of long dungeons when you're at your most vulnerable. And unlike gym leaders, which are other bosses you fight in this game, Blue's Pokemon grow at a similar rate to yours and his teams are well balanced. All of this creates this real fear for if he's going to show up and a sort of nervous anticipation when he does, because Blue's genuinely threatening, and losing to him means more than losing to anyone else in this game. That's also what makes him being the champion such an absolutely perfect twist. Throughout the whole game, you're told your goal is to reach the Pokemon League and beat the Elite Four. You have to train a ton and really refine your team to get to a point where you're strong enough to beat 4 straight super powerful trainers. And eventually, you do beat them, and it's really exciting, but just as you're about to be crowned the new champion of the Kanto region, you're told that, actually, you're not the first person to beat the Elite Four. Someone else already did a little earlier, and if you want to be considered the champion, you need to beat them in a battle first. And who could it be but the one guy who's always tried to steal your thunder? The one guy who always fights you when you least expect it, your one and only rival, Blue. At the time, this was a massive twist that was even stronger because of your constant struggle with Blue throughout the game. But that also made beating him so much more satisfying, and after that, the game feels truly complete. You spent this whole game racing around the region against Blue to see who could be the strongest, and in the end, you won. It's your achievement and your victory. Now imagine you were a game developer trying to plan out a sequel, and you wanted to recreate this experience. What would you think would be the core takeaways from all of this? I would think that the important part was that Blue was the perfect motivational tool for the player. He was challenging, mean, and scary, all of which made the players take him more seriously and made it more satisfying to beat him. Those features also motivated the players to push themselves more and try to be constantly prepared, because they never knew when they'd be thrown into a difficult battle with him. Blue made the player take the game more seriously and be more invested. And there are a lot of different ways to implement those ideas in a game. The fact that Blue was your rival was ultimately just a convenient mechanism to facilitate those goals. Unfortunately, it seems like the game designers for future Pokemon games didn't understand any of this. Rather than trying to lean into the villain role that made Blue so effective, the designers made a complete 180 with rivals, instead trying to make them really friendly. Now, generally speaking, I'm against the idea of video games trying to make a character the player's friend. Because technical limitations make it impossible to actually create a dynamic human-like character for you to bond with, if you want players to become emotionally invested in a character, they need to be either written really well or have to be integrated tightly into the gameplay in a way that makes them extremely useful or interesting to the player. You also have to be careful with how much you incorporate these characters into the game, because the more they appear, the more they have to be really engaging to justify pulling the player away from the main gameplay. But despite the new roles rivals were supposed to play in all of the sequels, instead of being interesting or adding anything to the game, rivals have become friendlier, weaker, dumber, and more invasive versions of themselves with each new iteration. In the 3D games, you still have to battle them randomly throughout the game, but the battles are mostly just tedious and irritating. While battles with Blue were tense and challenging as you had to muster together a team worn out from fighting your way through a dungeon, the 3D rivals are designed to be beaten easily, where their Pokemon are usually really weak and they even heal you before every battle in most games. The thing about rivals is that if their battles aren't challenging, then there's basically no reason for them to exist because they're just drawn out versions of regular battles you have throughout the rest of the game. But then in a really pathetic attempt, and what I guess is supposed to compensate for that, the game designers made the rivals show up everywhere to talk to you as your adventure partners, which frankly I would find annoying even if they were well written, but their dialogue is ripped straight out of a children's show where every line is either about friendship or explaining events that you literally just watched happen. To be fair, the latest games made an attempt to add some depth to the characters, but they're still written like bad children's cartoon characters, so it's still about as interesting as reading the back of a milk carton. Ooh, there's magnesium in this. Regardless, they serve no real purpose in the game other than to interrupt you and waste your time. But it gets a lot worse than just the rivals being annoying, because these stupid, overgrown children still do everything you do, just like Blue did. So whenever you beat a badge, they also beat the same badge at the same time. Whenever you get access to some special location, they're also all there. Anytime some big event happens, your little cluster is all there watching uselessly with you. This mindset for the rivals sharing your journey has gotten so deeply ingrained in the developers that in the latest games, your main rival, whose entire arc is about how weak and useless he is, even gets one of the only 3 legendary Pokemon in the entire game. Do you understand how insane that is? These characters, who are all about as capable and threatening as a sack of potatoes, all do exactly the same things you do as a part of the main story, down to even catching a literal god. These achievements, which are supposed to be a sign of your strength and ingenuity, are also earned by characters that can barely figure out how to walk straight. And look, Blue did also get all of the badges and beat the Elite Four, but he was actually challenging to beat, so it made sense. And even he didn't catch any legendaries. That was still only something you did. And yet somehow, in the 3D games, these adult toddlers all do every single thing you do, and then have the audacity to talk about how strong and impressive you both are for doing them. How is that anything other than extremely condescending? But it gets worse. Because your rivals appear so much in these games and have so much dialogue, your rivals are basically the main characters of the games, and you're effectively just another side character. I would even go so far as to say that you exist to complement their story in these games. You end up getting the starter that their starter is weak to. You beat all the badges just before them. You steal the championship away from them at the last minute. You force them to overcome difficult challenges and grow and master the world. Your journey ultimately doesn't matter in any of these new games. Everything you do is always framed in the context of your rivals. It's all so backwards. The whole point of the original games is that they're all about how you, the human player, are adventurous and creative and curious. It's the story of you journeying through a Pokemon world, discovering cool things, growing stronger and smarter, catching and raising cool Pokemon, finding and challenging literal legends. Your experiences, not someone else's, and certainly not some stupid computer characters. You know, it's kind of funny, but people have been saying that back in my day, Pokemon used to be better for most of the last 15 years. With every new generation of Pokemon games, people complain about how lazy the Pokemon are and how repetitive the games are nowadays, and that Pokemon used to be special. But this is usually dismissed by more level-headed people that reasonably respond with the fact that people criticizing the newer games are mostly comparing their experiences playing the games as adults to their nostalgic memories of playing the games as kids. They argue that when it comes down to it, every game does certain things well and other things poorly, but overall each new game is roughly the same quality as the previous ones except with some quality of life improvements. And to a certain extent, that argument isn't wrong, and some people may even be applying it to this video, saying that my praise for the originals was mostly just nostalgia for playing the games I grew up with. But in this case, that argument doesn't actually apply, because I grew up on generations 3 and 4, and I played Pokemon Red for the first time when I was 20 years old, right after having finished Generation 7. And let me tell you, I was absolutely shocked with how well that game aged, and how much more fun I had playing it than any of the 3D games that had come out to that point. I mean, yes, the graphics are bad, and a lot of stuff is really weird and not ironed out properly, but the game is still a way better experience than any of the 3D ones because the game developers clearly have a much better understanding of why people wanted to play them. You have a game with 151 interesting and unique Pokemon to use, and a big-ass world to find them in. Throw in some excuses to use your Pokemon, and you've got yourself a super fun adventure for all ages. I mean, sure, you can throw in some fun mini-games on the side and try to give the world some character, but the important part is that you maintain focus on the core experience of catching and using Pokemon. And for all their problems, the originals do that really well. They don't beat around the bush or come up with some convoluted reason for you to do what you're doing, they just hand you a Pokemon and tell you to go wild. But the 3D games throw in so much extra garbage that just takes time away from the core appeal of the franchise. You're constantly bogged down with stupid dialogue and excessive exposition that amount to nothing. Characters don't get any real development, the story never makes any real sense or has any stakes, and when it comes down to it, nobody actually cares about any of this nonsense because that's not why people play these games. All of the bullshit the 3D games are filled with ultimately add nothing to the world and just waste time. That's actually really what it comes down to for me. Putting aside the 2D games entirely, the 3D games are just objectively bad and boring games. And I would argue that's largely the result of compromises made to try to force a franchise designed to be 2D to work in 3D. And look, I'm not an idiot, I understand why Pokemon made the jump to 3D. 3D games are a lot more marketable than 2D ones, and the concept of a 3D Pokemon game attracted a lot more people to the newer games. I'm pretty confident that if the Pokemon Company had made more 2D Pokemon games instead of these 3D ones, even if those games were somehow designed perfectly, they would have sold significantly worse than any of the last 3 generations of 3D ones. It would have been dumb for the company not to make the games this way. But as a longtime fan of the franchise, I still hate it, and I still want the games to go back to being 2D and adventurous and, fun to play.